At what point were you pretty certain that you were going to Southeast Asia, that you were going to a real fight?
As soon as I saw orders to F-4 Phantoms, I knew that, and particularly since I was going to the West Coast, we knew that we would be taking part in the Vietnam conflict.
ideal way to develop combat skill against an enemy aircraft would be to fly the enemy aircraft yourself before you had to fight it. Of course, that's an impossible ideal. Or is it? Most U.S. pilots flying combat over North Vietnam will never see a MiG-21 on the ground at close range, much less get a chance to fly it. Tactical Air Command and Navy fighter and attack pilots recently completed a thorough evaluation of the MiG-21 weapon system, analyzing it in an operational environment with all United States combat aircraft. The purpose of this tactical evaluation was to identify deficiencies and limitations which could be exploited to defeat the MiG-21. Air combat maneuvering situations, which simulated the Southeast Asian operating environment, were set up, and tactical maneuvers were flown in order to validate their effectiveness against the MiG-21. The lessons learned could save you and get your name on the list of MiG killers. Here to describe the results of the evaluation and discuss the recommended maneuvers are two of the primary pilots who flew the MiG-21 in this project. Lieutenant Colonel Joe B. Jordan, Tactical Air Command, and Commander Thomas J. Cassidy, Navy Air Development Squadron 4.
The purpose of Project Doughnut was the tactical exploitation of the MiG-21 airplane. We compared the MiG-21 with all Air Force and Navy fighter and attack airplanes, flying over 100 sorties. The majority of the flights were tactical, however, several flights were devoted to the performance and stability envelope of the airplane. Several flights were flown for electronic intelligence gathering. Colonel Jordan flew the MiG-21 against all U.S. Air Force tactical airplanes. I flew the MiG-21 against all Navy fighter and attack airplanes. During the program, we exchanged several flights in an effort to compare tactical data. Joe, would you point out some of the performance characteristics of the MiG-21?
This MiG-21F-13 day fighter is a rugged, small, highly maneuverable, extremely reliable Mach 2 aircraft. It's capable of high G and low speed flight. We flew it as low as 120 knots in a tactical maneuvering situation. The aircraft has an excellent zoom capability and max power and an impressive turn capability due to its high thrust-to-weight ratio and low wing loading. The airspeed bleed-off in a high G sustained turn is very rapid below 400 knots due to its delta wing planform. This large model is the all-weather version. It's a fishbed B. The general appearance and most of the detailed features are almost identical to the one we flew. The pitot boom is mounted on the lower intake and is fitted with angle of attack and side slip vanes which feed into the gun sight system.
The inlet spike is movable, normally fully automatic, has a manual feature of positioning of 1.5 Mach number. It also houses the range-only radar for the gun sight. The permanently mounted pylon is fixed on the center line. It's capable of carrying a drop tank or a bomb. Outboard pylons are installed on the wings, capable of carrying ATOL missiles, bombs, or rockets. One stall fence is located on either side of the outboard wingtips. The flight control systems include an irreversible, hydraulically actuated stabilator. It has a stabilator ratio controller installed. It restricts stabilator movement below 16,000 feet and above 32,000 feet. It's also further restricted at high Q, approximately 510 knots below 16,000 feet. The rudder is manually actuated. The ailerons are manually actuated, hydraulically boosted. The cockpit is very small and narrow. The instruments and switches are crude by our standards.
The forward hinged clamshell canopy is very narrow, as Tom said. It restricts your head movement considerably in flight. In addition to this, there's a metal flap right up over your head. When you look around, for example, to see if there's someone on your tail like this, it completely blocks your vision in the rear area. Modifications to the aircraft in order to obtain good data included the installation of American instruments, we installed a G meter, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and a Mach meter. Over-the-shoulder cameras were mounted on the pilot's seat on either side of the cockpit to photograph the cockpit instruments in flight. The aircraft is equipped with selectable three-wheel air-operated brakes used for both wheel braking on takeoff and landing and taxiing. The engine acceleration is very slow, taking about 55 seconds to start and achieve idle power, and taking 15 seconds from idle to military power on run-up at the end of the runway. The afterburner will not light until you reach full military power, and it takes about 3 to 5 seconds.
Takeoff is normal. The rudder becomes effective at about 30 knots. Rotation at about 140 knots. Liftoff at about 170 knots. Gear retraction is normal. However, we have a neutral position on the wheel selector handle, which is not common in our airplanes. Acceleration to climb speed of about 400 knots to 0.88 Mach compares with the F-8 airplane. 0.88 is held to altitude. The airplane will climb at practically any speed above 250 knots.
Forward visibility through the sight combining and bulletproof glass seriously degrades acquisition of targets. In this area, F-4 and F-8 aircraft can normally be acquired within 3 to 5 nautical miles. Smoke trail sightings on our aircraft have been made beyond 15 miles from the forward side panel. Visibility to the rear is restricted in a 50 to 60 degree cone due to aircraft structure, low pilot's sitting position, and the narrow canopy. Side visibility in level flight is restricted to about 20 degrees below the horizon. Upper visibility, again restricted by the seat flap. From the side view, you can see that you are limited to a rather narrow area. Overall, the restricted visibility from the MiG is a very serious tactical limitation. The aircraft is vulnerable, much like most of our fighters, but maybe even more so. First, let's take a look. The engine, the fuel tanks, and the combination of the high-pressure air bottles. As you can see, this covers about 80% of the aircraft's total surface.
The airplane has an excellent speed and performance envelope. It's capable of Mach 2 flight at high altitude. Below 16,000 feet, we're airframe limited to 595 knots. Above 16,000 feet, 640 knots. During our evaluation, we encountered a duck buzz at about 0.93 Mach number. That's very difficult to exceed 0.93. 510 knots, you get very heavy longitudinal stick forces. That tends to limit the amount of stabilator available, thereby limiting the total number of G available. The turn capability of the airplane is excellent. At about 500 knots, you can sustain over 6G at 15,000 feet. However, at 400 knots and below, speed bleed off in a high G turn is excessive. And this is one point that we can capitalize on with our airplanes. We can pull about 3G at 280 knots and about 2.5G at 180 knots. The airplane is maneuverable down to 120 knots. It takes quite a bit of cross-controlling and pilot technique to keep from losing the airplane.
This duck buzz, or whatever occurs at low altitude between 9.3 and 9.5 Mach number, could be airframe buffet, duck buzz, or I'm not sure what. Whatever it is, the airplane starts shaking and vibrating so bad you can hardly read the instrument panel. The basic gun sight compares with the capabilities of that in the F-100 and the F-8, having a depressible pipper, a wing spanner, a manual ranging capability, 2 range meters for the automatic lock-on capability, one for guns and thousands of meters, and one in kilometers for missiles. It has an in-range, a breakaway, and a G-limit light for missiles only, a trigger and electrical cage button on the control stick grip. We found that in gun tracking, that we had normal lock-ons out beyond the gun range with no problem, but above 2 to 3 Gs in a tracking situation, we had quite a bit of gyro drift. It required continually electrically caging the button and letting it drift back. Also, we found that there was considerable pipper jitter during gun firing, which precluded tracking corrections during the gun firing. Here's a 30 millimeter shell case from one of our firings. As you can see, it's quite a bit larger than ours, carries a very lethal load if you happen to be hit with it. One interesting thing we found out about the aircraft is that the IR signature of the MiG is some 40 to 70% greater than our comparable aircraft, such as the F-104. Tom, how about giving us some size comparisons with the MiG and some of our aircraft?
One of the most apparent things we discovered during the program was the small size of the MiG-21. It gave us a lot of problems in the tactical evaluation phase since we continually lost sight of the airplane. It took quite a bit of training for the pilots to realize that the airplane was small. The lack of smoke trail initially made it extremely difficult to keep the airplane in sight. We have some scale model silhouettes of various large airplanes that we're employing in Southeast Asia. The F-100, which is obviously larger than the MiG-21, yet in flight closely resembles the MiG-21. The F-105 is obviously a much larger airplane, and in flight there is no comparison as far as silhouette goes. The F-8 is much larger than the MiG-21, yet in flight, from many aspects, it looks the same as the MiG-21, especially the side-on view. The F-4, again, is much larger, leaves quite a bit of smoke, and is easily recognizable when you compare it to the MiG-21. The F-111 is obviously bigger. There's really no comparison recognition-wise. The only thing we can compare is the wing platform of the MiG-21 against the horizontal stabilizer of the F-111. They're about the same size. We also did comparative performance evaluation between the MiG-21 and our first-line fighters. Overall, the MiG-21 and the F-4 are comparable below 25,000 feet. However, each has limitations that must be considered. The F-4 has greater sustained G available below 20,000 feet and above 425 knots. The MiG-21 has more instantaneous G available at any given airspeed than the F-4. In particular, a 2G advantage between 250 knots and 450 knots calibrated. Above 450 knots, the MiG-21 has 8G available. The MiG-21, when flown to optimum, will outturn the F-4 below 400 knots if the F-4 attempts a close-in turning engagement. The MiG-21, with its 55-pound wing loading, is 45% lower than the F-4, and the thrust-to-weight ratios are approximately equal. The fighter combat configured F-4 with missiles, no MERS or TERS, no centerline, has superior zoom capability from 10,000 feet to about 30,000 feet. The F-4 has superior level acceleration in burner, both at 30,000 feet from 0.8 to 1.25 Mach, and at 15,000 feet up to the Q limit of the MiG-21. The F-4 also has superior level acceleration in military power. Overall, the F-8 and the MiG-21 are comparable airplanes below 15,000 feet. The MiG-21 has approximately a 13% lower wing loading and a 25% greater thrust-to-weight ratio, and has more instantaneous G available at a given airspeed. At 10,000 feet, it can sustain a higher G in the 500-knot speed range. At 400 knots and 10,000 feet, the F-8 has approximately 0.5 to 1.0 sustained G advantage. The MiG-21, when flown to optimum, will outturn the F-8 below 400 knots in a close-in engagement, wing up or down. Zoom capabilities are comparable, with differences in external stores and engine trim being the deciding factor. The MiG-21 is superior in military power level acceleration. In combat-rated thrust, the aircraft are approximately equal, with the F-8 having a slight edge in the subsonic region with similar external configurations. The MiG-21 has a substantial advantage supersonic. Unloaded combat-rated thrust acceleration performance is equal out to approximately 1.2 Mach above 15,000 feet. Longitudinal control response in the F-8 is superior to the MiG-21 below 16,000 feet in the high Q area, above 510 knots. The F-8 has the capability to perform an escape maneuver by exceeding the MiG-21's limiting Mach below 16,000 feet. Droops must be used effectively and restrictions adhered to.
Tom, would you hand me the 105 model? Up to 15,000 feet, the F-105 and the MiG-21 are closely matched in both military and afterburner power in a clean configuration. Subsonic. Supersonic accelerations were not checked. The F-105 can fly well beyond the MiG-21's low-altitude Q limit, below 15,000 feet. This is one of the great advantages. The MiG-21 has a superior zoom capability throughout the envelope of the F-105. The turn comparison, the MiG-21 has a superior turn capability. The F-105 at very high speed and low altitude can initially negate an attack with a very high G turn. And that's about it for the F-105. Now, in comparing the F-106 with the MiG-21, at both 10,000 and 35,000 feet, the F-106 accelerates with the MiG in military and maximum power up to the Q limit of the MiG, or Mach 1.2. No acceleration checks were accomplished above 1.2 Mach. The F-106 has a slight advantage between 0.95 and 1.0 Mach in an afterburner acceleration. As most of our other aircraft, the F-106 can accelerate beyond the MiG's Q limit at low altitude. During zooms, the F-106 and the MiG also appear to be closely matched. The MiG-21 appears to have more instantaneous G available below 500 knots, but since wing loadings are comparable, the steady-state turn capability is very close. The MiG-21 can maintain a position slightly inside of the F-106 when the F-106 is turning at an optimum angle of attack.
Joe, how about the other Air Force airplanes we flew the MiG-21 against?
The F-100, it has some capability against the airplane. Of course, it can accelerate with it under most conditions. It can turn with it down at low speed. The F-104, of course, is a very high-speed airplane. It accelerates pretty much right along with the MiG-21 during level flight at medium, low, high altitude. In some areas it's a little better. But of course, the wing loading kills the F-104. Can't turn with him except 1.2 or above. So the 104, comparatively speaking, it's got to use hit-and-run tactics. Now the F-101, the F-111, some of the busts we ran against practically have no capability offensively except to exceed the Q limits of the aircraft at low altitude. What about some of your Navy attack airplanes?
Well, the A4 and the A7, comparable turning ability with the MiG-21. Their low thrust-to-weight ratio tends to restrict them on the offensive. In all cases, the A4 and the A7, by using a brake turn, could counter an attack by the MiG-21 if the brake was initiated at the right time and it was a hard brake. Close-in scissors, the A4 and the A7, maneuvered properly, are actually better airplanes, close-in, than the MiG-21. The A6, with spin assist engaged, was able to counter a MiG-21 attack with a hard brake turn and was actually able to gain the offensive in several cases. Summarizing the attack airplanes and actually all the fighter comparisons. During the program, we flew the MiG-21 to maximum performance in order to get the most out of it in our tactical comparisons. The intelligence information on the MiG-21 engagements in the Middle East War and again in the Vietnam War indicate that the MiG is not always flown to max performance. Our attack and fighter bombers have a very real offensive capability. Your decision to press an offensive attack should be made on the tactical situation and based on your opinion of the caliber of the MiG pilot that you encounter. But remember, the MiG-21 has a tremendous turn and maneuvering capability if it's flown properly.
Two of the most important things we've learned regarding tactics are, one, the basic maneuvers in the Navy and Air Force tactical manuals are still valid. And two, we must capitalize on the weaknesses of the MiG-21. And this is what we learned in 90 days living with a MiG-21. Does that look like about it, Tom?
I think you've got everything up there, Joe.
The simplicity, reliability, and maintainability of this aircraft is outstanding. It represents an excellent engineering achievement. We flew the aircraft on many occasions, 3 times a day, turned it around in 30 minutes. It's really a solid airplane.
During our 100 flights, we changed the tires and the brakes on the 50th flight, changed the oil filter on the 50th flight, and we had 3 very minor electrical problems with the EGT system. That was the sum total of the maintenance on 100 flights.
The Q limit of this aircraft is one of the items that we can really exploit. It's really limited compared to most of our tactical aircraft and our fighter aircraft below 15,000 feet. It's one of the items that we really want to work on. Drive the fight down or get out at a low altitude.
Keep your mark above 0.95. He gets quite a bit of airframe buffet at 0.93, and his stick is extremely heavy at 510 knots, all below 16,000 feet. This is the area we want to fly in.
The visibility limitations out of the MiG-21 is another significant area that we can exploit. Drive to his blind area. It's a very large blind area to the rear. You can't see out very well from the front. You can see out pretty well at the side, but it's one of the areas that most of our aircraft are much better designed than this aircraft in that area.
The flap above the pilot's headrest is extremely difficult to see around, and the 4-inch bulletproof windscreen is extremely difficult to see through. You can see F-8, F-4, F-105 type targets at 3 to 5 miles. However, the airplane can S-turn to get much better visibility out the forward side panels.
Detection. The MiG-21 is very small. Frontal view is about the size of an F-104. It's much smaller than many of our aircraft. The engine doesn't smoke under normal flight conditions. No smoke at all in afterburner. You can see it in a plan view close in, but still remember, it's a very difficult airplane to see.
During the program, we averaged less than 25 miles detection ranges on the F-4 radars. We averaged about 15-mile lock-ons with the F-4s.
The maneuvering performance. The aircraft will really turn, especially at the right speeds. Below 500 knots and down at low speed. We especially want to stay out of the low speed area, down from 400 knots on down. In this area, if we keep our speed above this area, we could do very good work with the MiG-21.
If we can get the MiG-21 to break and bleed off a lot of energy in the first 90 degrees of turn, we can truly capitalize on this thing. Once he's below 400 knots, it's extremely difficult to get his speed back. But remember, his radius of turn is very small, even below 400 knots.
His acceleration capability. In the medium speed range, the high altitude speed range, it compares with most of our aircraft. But when he gets down to a low speed, where he loses his energy, it's extremely difficult for him to unload and accelerate out. For example, the F-4, you have a capability of obtaining almost instantaneously 50 knots. The MiG-21 doesn't have this capability at all. He's very slow at accelerating.
Offensively, the MiG pilot can pretty much plan his throttle movement. Defensively, however, if he's at cruise power, it takes several seconds to get military power and several more seconds to get afterburner.
Climb and zoom capability. Previously, we had thought that the MiG-21 could out-zoom any free world fighter. We've demonstrated on many occasions that the F-4 could out-zoom the MiG-21 from 10,000 feet and steady conditions under almost any configuration. This is an area that the aircraft apparently falls short in.
The energy maneuverability curves for the MiG-21 that we have appear to be optimistic.
Also, our energy maneuverability data on the F-4 appears to be slightly pessimistic. This may account for that particular item. The weapon system of the MiG-21. It's very crude compared to most of our later systems. It compares favorably with ours about 10 to 15 years ago. Remember, you can beat it. It has some limitations with the gun sight, but the Red Baron can take advantage of a ring and post sight and that relatively slow-firing cannon and get in there close and maybe do some good work. So watch this particular item.
Remember, a hard turn up to about 4 Gs will probably defeat the ATOL missile if you see it in flight.
The GCI requirements. The MiG-21 and the basic Russian or Soviet bloc countries' fighter doctrine is based on a point interceptor capability for the MiG-21. This means it requires GCI. So remember that without a GCI capability, the aircraft is pretty much limited.
The MiG-21 pilots are basically trained as interceptor pilots. However, the airplane has a real capability. And when it's employed as a fighter airplane, it's an effective airplane.
How about giving us our successful basic tactics, Tom?
Generally speaking, in our basic tactics, keep your energy level high cruising, keep your energy level high when you're maneuvering. Above all, be aggressive. Drag the fight down below 16,000 feet. Fly the airplane and fight the airplane on your terms. Provide mutual support. Always maneuver to his blind spot. Exploiting these limitations should prove successful. Remember, gentlemen, we're dealing with a Mach 2 airplane with the turn capability of an A4. Joe, I think we should break out the handbook on the fitter and be prepared to fly it.
Raj.
Flying a 105 was the greatest experience a person can ever have. It was an airplane originally designed as a nuclear strike aircraft to be flown low level. It was extremely fast. In fact, it was the fastest airplane in the world till the F-111 came along below 10,000 feet.
And it was a carrier-based ground attack airplane in Vietnam. And this airplane actually dropped more bombs in North Vietnam than any Navy carrier-based airplane.
You cannot place statues or build memorials in thin air. These airplanes, rescued, restored, returned to the sky, are the memorials. Through them, we give enduring thanks to those who gave everything they had to defend everything that we hold dear. By sharing them, we remind each other of the sacrifice. By sharing them, we introduce our heirs to their heritage. One week each summer, these national treasures are flown here. Twice each day, those who restored them present them to those who risked their lives to fight in them. And those who really did it tell the rest of us how it really was. It is a singular series of history lessons that anyone who cherishes liberty ought to see. As the Vietnam War escalated, Air Force and Navy pilots started flying more and more missions over Laos and North Vietnam. This was very high-risk duty. The North Vietnamese, thanks to Soviet support, had built one of the best air defense systems in the history of strategic aerial warfare. At this Warbirds in Review forum, two iconic aircraft of the Vietnam era, the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk and the A-1 Skyraider, and the pilots who flew them into those treacherous skies, were featured. Paul Wood, the founder and president of the Warbird Heritage Foundation, introduced the two aircraft. They are part of the foundation's Flying collection.
And our mission is to acquire, restore, and operate historic military aircraft. Two of our collection, we have about 12 in the collection right now, and two of them are here with us today. This represents our Vietnam segment of our museum. So we do have a website if you're interested in more information on either of these airplanes or any other airplanes in our collection. It's www.warbird.heritagefoundation.org. And we have lots of pictures and videos on each of the airplanes. We have cockpit pictures, we have maintenance pictures, so we have the airplanes taken apart. You can see inside, see what makes these things run. So you're welcome to get on the website, sign the guest book, and we send out periodic newsletters and things like that. So that's the pitch. So we have with us two phenomenal Vietnam era airplanes here. One is the AD Skyraider and the A4 Skyhawk. Both played very, very significant roles in Vietnam. And the one to my right here is an A1 Skyraider. And it was designed by a guy by the name of Ed Heinemann from the Douglas Aircraft Company, who was a very famous designer. And coincidentally, he also was the lead designer on the A4 Skyhawk as well. Now, the next one over here real quickly is our A4 Skyhawk. And it was a carrier-based ground attack airplane in Vietnam. And this airplane actually dropped more bombs in North Vietnam than any Navy carrier-based airplane. It was again designed by Ed Heinemann, the Douglas Aircraft Company, and it had nicknames of the Scooter, Heinemann's Hot Rod, the Bantam Bomber, and there's a great loyal fan base of the pilots who flew this airplane. Every time we have someone come up to us and say, I used to fly the Scooter, that's the best airplane I ever flew. And I tend to agree with them because I fly these things as well. So the Skyhawk was first produced in 1956. There were multiple models of the airplane. This is the same airplane, by the way, for those of you who don't know, that Jester and Viper flew in Top Gun as the aggressor pilots, so got a little notoriety there. They flew them they produced them until 1979. And the Blue Angels flew the F version of this from 73 to 86. About 3,000 of them were built. So a couple of significant points about this. When Ed Heinemann designed this airplane, the concept of it was to make it as light as possible so it could carry bombs, rockets, and fuel. So they left a lot of things out. For instance, this airplane doesn't have a battery. And most airplanes will have batteries or you can start them. But in order to save weight, they took the battery out. They took a lot of the oil scavenge and recovery systems out. So when they would ferry these airplanes from the West Coast to the Philippines, they'd do about 5 in-flight refuelings to get them over there. And the biggest problem was running out of oil, not running out of gas, because the oil system here doesn't recover itself. It just there's vents in the back, and so the oil kind of gradually leaks out over time. So the biggest issue was running out of oil instead of running out of gas. This airplane is painted up as an A4 Charlie model that was flown by a guy by the name of Lieutenant Commander T.R. Schwartz aboard the Bonhomme Richard in the Yankee Station. And Schwartz is credited actually with the only air-to-air kill by an A4 Skyhawk in Vietnam. He was on a ground attack mission and rolled off his target and found a MiG and shot it with some unguided air-to-ground missiles, and actually was lucky enough to hit the target. So.
The second airplane featured, the A1 Skyraider, was designed near the end of World War II. It became one of the Navy's workhorses during the Korean War.
The Skyraider was first produced in 1946, and it was used in the Korean War initially by the Navy and the Marine Corps as a ground attack, carrier-based ground attack airplane, and it was quite effective, sort of taking the role of what a typical new A-10 would do at the time. The production run ran until about 1957, and over 3,200 of them were built. The engine is a Wright 3350. It's got 18 cylinders, 2 rows of 9, so there's 36 spark plugs in this thing when you have to change the spark plugs, so it's a lot of work. And it generates 2,700 horsepower, so it's one of the largest piston-driven airplanes that the Department of Defense ever had. Actually, I think it's the largest single-engine piston-driven airplane that they had. The airplane is about 11,000 pounds empty weight. but the significant part about this airplane is it can carry its own weight in fuel and armament. So its max takeoff weight is about 22,000 pounds. So when you think about that, 11,000 pounds is what, 5.5 tons? And you can see some of the armament and bombs and fuel and things like that. And so it was really able to put a lot of armaments on target. And with its fuel capacity, it had the ability to loiter for up to 5 or 6 hours at a time. So it had great range, great loiter time, and could put a lot of metal on target. So it's about a 290 knot airplane, give or take. So it's not real fast, but it's built very, very strong and tough, and it could take a big beating. After Korea, the Air Force purchased about 580 of these from the Navy and converted them to A1Hs and Js. They were used in the Vietnam conflict primarily for special operations, search and rescue, and light ground attack. And there were several squadrons of these that were helicopter escorts to help provide cover for helicopters coming in and recovering down pilots. And so that's, our airplane here is painted up like an A1H from the 6th Special Operations Squadron, which was in Pleiku, Vietnam.
Dick Diller, an Air Force pilot learning to fly the massive Skyraider, had a huge transition to make. In one way, airplanes fall into one of two design categories, either nose wheel or tail wheel. The Skyraider is a tail wheel aircraft. All of Diller's previous training had been in nose wheel airplanes.
Yeah, that was a real transition. Out of pilot training, I got an F-106 assignment, and I flew F-106s for 19 months in the fighter squadron at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware in the 95th. And then I got assigned to the A1, and when I got down to Hurlburt, we got, as Sam said, we got a tail wheel, we got a big reciprocating engine with cowl flaps and fuel mixture, and all the other things that are involved in an airplane with reciprocating engine. And so it was a real transition to go to a tail wheel, and the mission was different also. The interceptor was what we did in the F-106, going after incoming invaders, if you will, Soviet bombers. If they were going to come in, that was the defense against those. Whereas this mission was air to ground, and it was a totally different mission.
On December 5th, 1969, Dick Diller took part in what is still considered the largest wartime search and rescue mission ever mounted. Captain Benjamin Danielson and his weapons system officer, First Lieutenant Woody Bergeron, were shot down in their McDonnell Douglas F-4C Phantom, call sign Boxer 22, over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in northeastern Laos. It would be decades before Captain Danielson could be confirmed as having been killed in action. However, Lieutenant Bergeron was rescued after spending 50 hours in enemy territory. Search and rescue Skyraiders were nicknamed Sandys. Dick Diller flew as a Sandy forward air controller for the Boxer 22 mission.
The Sandys went out, the Sandys were on 5-minute alert, just like we did in F-106s. And the alert schedule was the same type thing. So the Sandys rushed out to the airplane and launched and took off and went over about 60 miles east of the base is where the action was. And the first thing you got to do is you got to eliminate the threat of guns, because when you have guns that are firing at you, you can't bring a helicopter in to hover over a survivor and pick him up with guns shooting at him. So you got to get rid of the guns first. And so with the help of the forward air controllers, the Sandys, actually the Sandy low lead is the on-scene commander, and he comes in and he trolls low level trying to get the guns to shoot at him so they can find out where the guns are and try to knock them out. Now the problem with it was they put the guns in the caves and the karst. The karst were limestone formations that came straight up out of the ground, and they'd have caves at the base of them, and that's where they put the guns, so you had to hit them pinpoint. And that was, as I understand, I was told that was the very first time that the laser-guided weapons had been used to knock out the opposition. So then you can bring the helicopter up the river. The survivors were on opposite sides of a river, And you bring the helicopter up the river at low altitude and hover above them and pick them up. Well, the problem with it was the tail rotor on the helicopter that was hovering above the survivor got caught in trees. The aircraft commander on the helicopter thought that he was getting ground fire, and because of that he decided that he had to pull out, and as he pulled away, the survivor said, "Why did he leave?" He said, "I was 5 feet from the hoist. Why did he leave? I was 5 feet from him." And it just broke our heart because it was so close to getting the guy out of there, and we couldn't get him out. So we had to leave him overnight, and the next day it was more of the same. The problem with it was the first thing we heard in the morning from the survivor was that the front seater had been killed in the night. They didn't take prisoners in Laos at the time that I was flying over there. They just shot whoever they came across. And he said that after he got picked up, he said that what happened was the worst time was just towards dark when everybody had gone home. All the Skyraiders had left and all the attack airplanes had gone. The worst time was just, it wasn't quite dark yet. They didn't have flashlights, but they still had a light illumination in the sky. And they came down to the river and they started looking for him. They found his place where he had been holed up there, and he said that they shot the AK-47 into that area there. He said he had moved up the river about 50 yards, and he said if they turned around, they would have seen me. They left, and he survived the night. It was on the third day we finally got him picked up, and that was a cause for great celebration on the base. There was hundreds and hundreds of missions that had been flown in support of rescuing this one guy, and he's still alive and lives in South Georgia. His name is Woody Bergeron. He was originally from New Orleans. This passage was written in response to the mother of one of the guys that I had just flown with was shot down. And he was, I had just talked to him and became friends with him, and I had flown with him the night before. And the night he was shot down, I was going to go out about 2 hours later. So I was in briefing when the word came into the command post that he had been shot down. By the way, in my squadron, the time we were there, out of 20 pilots in the squadron, we lost 7 of our pilots. So it was not a good situation. But he was shot down, and he was in the same airplane I had been in the night before. Well, his mother didn't want to accept just that he wasn't going to come home, so she wrote a letter to the wing commander asking about information about what happened to her son, and this is why this passage was written in response to that. I was talking about, the letter made me realize why my mother was trying so hard not to cry that morning nearly a year ago at O'Hare International Airport when she and Dad and Emily saw me off. She had said, "Be careful, Dick." "I will, Mom, don't worry." I knew I was well trained and I could only imagine the hazards that lay ahead, but now I knew about those hazards firsthand, and thanks to Rick's mother's letter, I could see a family side. The ones left at home a little more clearly, and that may have been the more difficult to handle. I have had it said to me, I don't know if I would have had the courage to do what you did, to face danger without flinching. You're lucky because you know you've got what it takes. Well, I never know how to reply to that because I don't know if I could do it again. All I know is I did it then, and I was one of the lucky ones who survived. That feeling of invincibility is essential to anyone who looks danger in the eye and keeps going. But the tragedies of Rick Shorlands and J.B. East and Clint Ward and Bob Moore and Dick Lytle and Jim Herrick and all my other friends who had been killed and the sadness of their families brought me back to the reality that we were playing for keeps and no one is invincible. What she had said in her letter, she said, I want to have more information about what he was doing, who he was flying with, where he was, and what happened to him. And then she wrapped it up by saying, a piece of paper is not much of an exchange for a son.
The F-105 Thunder Chief, nicknamed Thud, was the largest single-engine fighter ever flown by the Air Force. It was designed in the early 1950s to deliver a nuclear bomb. Well, when that nuke mission seemed off the table, the airplane was reconfigured into a single-engine fighter and conventional weapons bomber. It did a great job in the skies over Southeast Asia. It had a short wingspan, only 35 feet. That's about the same as a Piper Cub, and it was 60 feet long and could reach Mach 2. That was only 10 feet shorter than a B-17. Dave Waldrop flew the Thud over North Vietnam.
Flying a 105 was the greatest experience a person can ever have. It was an airplane originally designed as a nuclear strike aircraft to be flown low level, single pilot, radar terrain avoidance, all weather. The airplane was extremely sophisticated. It was extremely fast. In fact, it was the fastest airplane in the world till the F-111 came along below 10,000 feet. And it was an airplane in spite of its size, and this is what most people just can't comprehend. You probably, especially you that are pilots, you probably heard people talking about you wear the airplane, you become part of it and stuff like that. You generally wouldn't think of a big airplane that's some 60 feet long, 35 feet wide, that grosses about 53,000 pounds on takeoff. You wouldn't think of wearing that airplane. You'd think more of just flying the airplane. But once you got comfortable with the airplane, I did not even have to look inside at the instruments. I knew exactly where I was with that airplane. And it was because the airplane was so well balanced. And it was a terrific airplane in formation. And it would carry a lot of armament, and it would take a lot of abuse. And unfortunately, those poor airplanes, they got some abuse. It was just so solid, and like I said, it would take all this abuse and still get you home. And I've got pictures at home showing holes as big around as I am through the wing. One guy got hit with a ATOL, which is our version, or the North Vietnamese Soviet version of the Sidewinder. The thing actually went off, blew the back end of the engine, the tail feathers, turkey feathers, and for the afterburner and so forth, just blew them off. And the rocket motor actually embedded in the side of the airplane. He flew the thing home.
In the Vietnam era, aerial dogfighting, like in World War II, was largely a thing of the past. However, dogfighting did happen in Southeast Asia. U.S. pilots also had to avoid barrages of supersonic surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, which were deployed all around the Hanoi area. Dave Waldrop was transferred to Korat, Thailand, where he continued flying these high-risk missions over Hanoi. He explained why August 23, 1967 is a day he will never forget.
I got there, since I was already had more missions than anybody at Korat over Hanoi. They made me an immediate flight lead, so I was flying number 3 in crossbow flight. And we were going up on a big railroad yard, Yen Vinh Railroad Yard, which is just across the, not the Mekong, but the Red River from Hanoi. And it was such a big target that they actually were attaching 2 F-4 Phantom strike flights along with our 4 F-105 strike flights.
As Waldrop and his flight headed toward Hanoi, they were joined by Colonel Robin Olds and his flight of F-4 Phantoms. The Phantoms were there to deter MiG fighters who came up to attack the F-105s. Well, because the Thud was faster than the Phantom, the operations had to be very carefully timed to prevent the Thuds from outrunning their escorts. As the F-105s started their runs from northwest of Hanoi, the Air Force's radar surveillance aircraft, nicknamed Big Eye, was orbiting off the coast of North Vietnam.
And sure enough, Big Eye, and we hadn't seen very few MiGs during my tour. I started in May all the way through. I had probably, at this point, right at close to 55, 60 missions. Very few MiGs. And so they started calling bandits, bullseye. Bandits are what they referred to as the MiG. That meant that they're taking off out of the Hanoi area. Then they started calling out vectoring west. And well, this was an afternoon sortie. Where's the sun in the afternoon? Now, about 3 o'clock position, or I mean about 9 o'clock if you're looking at 12 o'clock, using that as a reference. So they was in the west. And these MiGs were taking off out of Hanoi, heading west, and we were coming in. Remember I mentioned the 2 refueling routes, depending on which way you were coming in. We were coming in from the west, overland, where we did our refueling. And so we're coming in, the MiGs are obviously up, they're headed out our direction, somewhere. So Robin says, okay, we're searching, we're looking for them. And we now have turned the corner and are heading toward Hanoi. We've gone around the backside of Thud Ridge, we're now pointed toward Hanoi, and we're just about to reach the push-up point, and the big guy starts calling, bandits, bandits, at your 6. And so everybody's looking. Force commander calls Robin and says, Robin, find these guys, get them off our ass. And so Robin said, I'm doing everything I can, guys, we're looking for them. And Robin Olds, and when he said he was doing everything he can, I promise you, he was doing everything he could. Well, Robin's doing everything he could, but he was trying to stay near us as well, so he couldn't go 40 miles behind us so he can throw his search radars toward us. That just doesn't work like that. And so anyway, 2 MiG-21s come through. They launch out 2 of their ATOL missiles, which I remember I said earlier is a heater, a heat seeker, and knock down 2 F-4s right behind my flight. So we hadn't even hit the push-up point. Now we got guys hollering, Mayday, Mayday, bail out, bail out. Beepers going off, and when you eject from one of these fighters, you got a beeper that goes off. It sounds like, ew, 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 ew. We got 3 of those things going off because one of the guys did not get out of the airplane. We got 3 of those beepers going off. We're trying to concentrate on going inbound on the target. And guys, that was a lot of stuff taking place. And like I said, we hadn't even hit the push-up point. Well, but what you do, as I mentioned earlier, there's nothing you can do about those guys. There is no rest gap where they were. We kept driving. We kept driving right on in toward the target. And we did, and when we got to the target, I started seeing all these MiG-17s. Well, our job was to bomb a railroad yard, not to chase MiGs. So we're doing our thing now, and as a flight, we're all oriented in our positions for rolling in on the target. We're about 15,000 feet, and would roll in on the target, usually make about a 45, 90-degree turn rolling in as you approach the target. Right before I reached the roll-in point, the F-105 had probably the most sophisticated advanced fire control system of any fighter in the world at that point in time and space. It was deadly accurate. I've shot many, many air-to-air targets with that airplane. If you're smooth at all and you put the pipper on some part of an airplane, that's what you're going to hit. Well, the only thing you got to have the pipper. The pipper is a little dot. And then outside from the dot, you got these rings. That there's 2 concentric rings, and it gives you a reference of how big that airplane is, because you can see as you're getting closer, obviously his wings are going to fill up more of that area. So you had an idea of your range, how far out you are. Plus, when you had your radar working and locked on, it's telling you exactly how far out it is. It was beautiful. Well, the only problem is you got to have those rings and a pipper up there to use them. And my bulb burned out as I was approaching the target. That means I'm looking at just a clean windscreen, and it's just like there's just glass up there. And so I had no sight, but I said, well, I've been here, done this many times, so I just rolled in. I looked about right, and at 7,000 feet, I pickled off. I pulled hard to the right like our flight leader had briefed, and I started looking for him, and as I'm looking for him, I look up, and heading west away from the target area was a F-105 Thunder Chief. He was going straight and level, which is absolutely, like I mentioned earlier, an absolute no-no. And there were 2 MiG-17s right on his butt. The lead MiG, it's got a 37 millimeter, I think it's 37, 35 millimeter cannon in the nose, and that thing is going poof, 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 just like that. I could still see it like August 23rd, 1967, the picture I was looking at. He's shooting at this 105. He's only about 1,500 feet behind him. The guy's going straight and level, had no clue these MiGs were there. And I holler out over the radio. I said, 105, head west, you got 2 MiGs on your ass, do something. Of course, there was 20 105s up there. And he just kept driving straight. And in all fairness, what we generally did is switch over to our flight frequency, because there's so much chatter up there, so much conversation, you couldn't communicate as a flight to get rejoined. And so he probably never heard it, but still he was going straight level. So I said, well, here's your shot. And I said, I got to get these guys off of him. I had a Sidewinder. Remember, that's a heater. And it seeks out the temperature. It looks for the heat signature from the jet engine. And that's what it hones in on. And my Sidewinder, and it makes this growling sound in your headset when it's got a heat source. And it was looking at that damn heat source, and it was just screaming its head off, come on, Dave, let me fly, let me fly. And I look at that 105, I looked at MiG behind him, I couldn't do it. The 105's engine is probably 4, maybe 5 times bigger than a MiG's engine, putting out that much more heat, and I could never have lived with myself if I let that thing fly and have it go to the 105. Remember, I didn't have a sight. That would have been the way to go. So anyway, I just turned the volume off on the Sidewinder, and I punched everything off the airplane. My tanks, my bomb rack. That was back then that was a Cadillac, $6,000 for a bomb rack. I punched it off with a panic button, and I still left my outboard pylons. In other words, I had my Sidewinder still, but I lit the full afterburner. I half-G'd the airplane. Anybody that flies airplanes know that when you unload a wing on an airplane, you remove the induced drag off that wing, and you really can start moving. Well, the 105, it was in its element now, because that's what it did. It went fast. So I lit the torch. I dove down so I could come up underneath these guys. So I'm sitting there trying to figure my game plan. Now you got to remember, I'm just a dumb shit lieutenant. And so I hadn't got as much experience as a lot of these fighter pilots have got. And I really do mean that. I wish I had of, because I could have probably thought through this thing a lot better and been more prepared for it. But I did do the best that I thought I could at the time. So I took it low so they wouldn't see me coming. And I decided, well, I'll roll in on number 2 and try to swing over on number 1. The last thing I saw on my airspeed indicator was 1.3 Mach. For those that don't, Mach 1 is supersonic. That means I'm doing right at about 900 miles an hour. Something like that, right? And I didn't realize at the time how slow this 105 and the MiGs were going. I really didn't. I know one thing, they didn't have their burner on, which the MiGs did not, and neither did he, which sort of surprised me, because you would think the MiGs would have to have the burner on to keep up with the 105, period. But you know, there was a lot going on, and that just hadn't quite sunk into my computer yet. And but they did not have the burner going, so I'm smoking now, and so I'm coming up low, and I'm starting to make my pull toward number 2 MiG. All of a sudden, now my eyeballs start getting a sense of speed differential here. And I realize that I am absolutely it's smoking like hell, and I'm gonna overshoot, and that's the last thing you wanna ever do, is overshoot and have an enemy airplane positioned behind you. So what I did is I pulled hard. In fact, my G meter when I got home was 7.5 to 8 Gs. I did it smooth though, so that made it okay. And I pull and I open up with my cannon. Now the 105 had one of the finest air-to-air weapons in the world, which was a 20 millimeter cannon. Is a Vulcan cannon. It had 6 barrels. It fired 6,000 rounds a minute of 20 millimeter. And we had high explosive shells on board. And so I start my pull, and I just, well, I'm opening up on, and I was actually on his left side, and I thought I saw a flash on his left wing that where I hit him. But like I said, I was just smoking. And so I didn't get a chance to really dwell on it very long. And so I'm going up now, I'm almost vertical. There was a broken layer of clouds, and with the clouds, it was sort of like, well, just assume where his knees are, there's a cloud layer. And they were broken, and when I went up, I just went up screaming. I popped my boards, I go up over the overcast, and I'm sitting up there, upside down, inverted, saying, "You stupid lieutenant, you had one shot at a MiG and you blew it." At about that time, remember the cloud layer's right about here. Out from underneath this cloud layer is a MiG-17 with his afterburner going. I'm sorry about that, guys. And I said, oh my God. And so I'm sitting up there inverted. The MiG's right here. I pull my nose down. I just ease forward a little bit on him, open up, and the first shells went right through the cockpit. Now that might sound like something that's okay, but there still was respect for the pilots in these other airplanes. I think you've seen plenty of World War II, cases of this. But anyway, the first bullets went right through the cockpit and worked their way down the left side of the airplane. And while I'm actually shooting at this guy, if you ever see my film, you'll see this. 105, totally. He never saw this because we talked about it when I got back, to Karat. He never saw us, but he went right between us. A big ball of fire comes out behind the 105, and I never saw. I didn't really realize what was going on until later. But apparently, I had a drop round because he was below my firing line, and apparently, I had a drop round that caught his fuel tank. And at that, with all the MiGs, everybody punched their tanks off, so nobody brought home a compromised tank with a hole in it. When they got back to Kokoda or Karat, everybody had clean airplanes, so we never found out who that was.
During the question and answer period, Dave Waldrop described the techniques they used to neutralize the SAM threat.
Well, yeah, what you're talking about is some of our SAM evasive tactics. Yeah, obviously we didn't just sit there. If a SAM's coming your direction, you don't just sit there and wait to see if it hits you. And I don't mean that to be smart or not. But you'd have to see it. You'd have to see it and project its trajectory. And what you would generally try to do from where we were located, our best defense was to break hard into the missile and down. Because it's got a certain amount of acceleration momentum, and like I said, that thing cranks up to about Mach 2 by the time it's getting to the target area. And so our best tactic, if we saw it, was to break into it as fast as we could go before it had a chance to change direction and home in on it.
Richard Nixon said, quote, "No event in American history is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War. It was misreported then, and it's misremembered now," end quote. Perhaps the best antidote for misunderstanding and misreporting is to simply listen to Dick Diller, Dave Waldrop, and the hundreds of thousands of others who served in Southeast Asia. On this day, their collective experiences, told in their own words, certainly had the Warbirds in Review audience thinking and remembering.